We are starting a new sermon series today called Christian Clichés. You know the clichés I'm talking about. Everything happens for a reason. God helps those who help themselves. Whenever God closes a door, he opens a window. Sayings that we all may have repeated at one point or another, but never examined more closely. And when we do examine them more closely, we discover, as Pastor Adam Hamilton says, that they are only half-truths, sayings we use to avoid careful thinking about complex issues or to justify our biases and prejudices. And sometimes we learn that these sayings can bring pain to others unintentionally. In the midst of the collective trauma we're experiencing, I've heard a lot of cliches. It seems easier to repeat phrases than to spend the mental and emotional energy making sense of the virus, making sense of life in isolation, our political climate, our estrangement from family and friends. So I thought it would be worth our time as a community to spend several weeks talking about some of the most common Christian cliches. And if these are words that you have spoken before, this sermon series is not meant to be an indictment. Instead, it's meant to help each of us think more deeply about what we really want to say and what we really want to affirm in those moments when we resort to cliches. We're going to begin with a cliche that I've heard more times than I can count in recent months. Everything happens for a reason. And to help us think about this phrase, we're going to turn to the book of Job. Job is one of the most ancient biblical texts. Some scholars say that the book of Job may predate Judaism. It's a Mesopotamian tale that has been told for generations before ever making it into the Bible, which tells us that people have been trying to make sense of human suffering for as long as we've been alive. So I invite you to hear this ancient story from the very beginning and from the very beginning of the book of Job. There was once a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camel, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and very many servants. So that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. His sons used to go and hold feasts in one another's houses, and in turn, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the feast days had run their course, Job would send and sanctify them. And he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." This is what Job always did. One day, the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil." Then Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a fence around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well, all that he has is in your power. Only do not stretch out your hand against him." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. One day, when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the eldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing and the donkeys were feeding beside them, and the Sabeans fell on them and carried them off and killed the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 columns, made a raid on the camels and carried them off and killed the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house, and suddenly a great wind came across the desert, struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead. I alone have escaped to tell you." Then Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell on the ground and worshipped. He said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The unimaginable happened to a family in our church this week. On Monday morning, the Smiths got word that healthy, happy, active Big had wrecked on his way home from a weekend of hunting and did not survive to speak of it. How could this happen? No, why did this happen? Where is God in the midst of this suffering? These are the questions facing the Smith family and facing many of you. These are the questions I've been trying to hold for Kim and Lainey and Shay. And let me say what a privilege it is to do that, to stand here as your pastor and get to ask these questions with you, to sit in the pain and suffering with you, to love you. It is odd that there are many whom I have not yet met, but that does not lessen the love I feel for you, nor does it lessen the grief I feel in the wake of this tragedy. So here we are, sitting with unthinkable news. In religious terms, this week served up theodicy on a platter. That's the fancy religious word for the problem of evil and suffering. Basically, theodicy boils down to this: if God is all-loving, then God does not want pain to come to anyone. And if God is all-powerful, then God can prevent anything painful or evil from happening. So either God is all-loving or God is all-powerful. Or at least that's what gets implied when we try to explain suffering, saying things like, everything happens for a reason. For as long as time, very smart people have struggled with the question of why evil exists in the world. Why doesn't God intervene when bad things happen? Or as Rabbi Harold Kushner simply says, why do bad things happen to good people? Isn't that the question we're all left to ask this week? Big was a good man. He was faithful. He loved his family loved him, he was a hard worker, he did things the right way. So why did such a bad thing happen to a good man? And why are we left sitting with our pain? A long time ago, there was another good man. He too was faithful. He too loved his family, and his family loved him. He too was a hard worker and did things the right way. His name was Job. And even though Job was a good person, he came to know unbelievable pain and suffering and darkness. Job's story is our story. That's one of the greatest gifts of biblical texts, that the universal becomes particular so that we can come to see the particular as universal. Job's is the ultimate story of suffering. Job did everything right. Any way you want to define success, Job had it. He was a business owner, and his business kept growing and growing. His children went to Ivy League schools and landed jobs with health insurance right after graduation. He had 2 homes. He had the fancy cars. He always got a bonus. He belonged to the best clubs. He was the most respected leader in his church and in his community. Job had everything. And then, almost out of the blue, Job lost everything. He lost his children when the wind blew so hard that it collapsed their house on their heads. A fire came and killed his servants and his sheep. He lost his business when someone stole all of his animals. And Job just got one piece of bad news after another. And after he'd lost everything, he collapsed, and he sat on a heap of ashes. And as Job sat down in shock, his friends started showing up. His first friend showed up and wanted to visit with him and said, "Job, I'm so sorry, man. But you know, everything happens for a reason. You must have been sinning or something, and if not you, then it must have been one of your children, even if you didn't know it, because this wouldn't happen to you without a reason." Then another friend shows up to visit Job. He says, "Man, I'm so sorry for your loss. God must have needed some more angels." And then the next friend comes by to visit Job and comes in with great confidence and says, "Job, God is writing a better story." Isn't it so human to want to explain the pain away, to supply a reason for the suffering? Job didn't need an explanation. He needed someone to sit with him in his suffering. And this is where Job teaches us a lesson. Instead of going along with his friend's explanations, Job never blames God, and Job never buys into the logic of his friends that God would choose to do this to him for some yet-to-be-revealed reason. Now, this doesn't answer the glaring question of why suffering exists, but Job shows us and teaches us something better, I think. Because instead of trying to solve suffering or explain it away, Job shows us that it's in our suffering that we affirm what we know of God. Job knew that God is a God of life. And if God is a God of life, then God does not will us to suffer. Job also teaches us that God allows suffering, and that's a hard thing to swallow. But Job does teach us a better question. Instead of trying to answer the question, why does suffering exist, or why does God allow suffering, Job shows us that the better question is, how shall we walk through our days of suffering? I was reminded this week of a sermon which has been helpful to me in making sense of suffering. It was preached by someone I've mentioned to you before as a theological hero of mine, the Reverend Bill Coffin. In early January 1983, Alex Coffin, Bill Coffin's son, and his friend Thomas were returning from a tennis match. They were driving in a terrible storm. They'd had a few too many beers and missed a curve along the harbor, and they drove directly into a South Boston channel shortly after midnight. Thomas, the friend who was in the passenger seat, somehow managed to escape through the car window, but Alex was trapped in the car and died. 10 days later, Bill Coffin, who was the senior pastor of the Riverside Church in New York City at the time, climbed up into the pulpit and preached a sermon called Alex's Death, in which he reflected on how some people came to his aid while others compounded his grief. Bill Coffin wrote in that sermon, "When a person dies, there are many things that can be said, and there is at least one thing that should never be said. The night after Alex died, I was sitting in the living room of my sister's house outside of Boston when the front door opened and in came a nice-looking, middle-aged woman carrying about 18 quiches. When she saw me, she shook her head, then headed for the kitchen, saying sadly over her shoulder, 'I just don't understand the will of God.' Instantly, I was up and in hot pursuit, swarming all over her. 'I'll say you don't, lady. Was it God's will that Alex was driving too fast in the rain? Did God have his hands on the steering wheel? Was it God's will that Alex had a few too many beers to be driving that night? Was it God's will that that stretch of road on Boston Harbor had no signage warning about that dangerous curve?' He went on to say, 'For some reason, nothing so infuriates me as the incapacity of seemingly intelligent people to get it through their heads that God doesn't go around this world with fingers on triggers and his fist around knives and hands on steering wheels. God is dead set against all unnatural deaths. And Christ spent an inordinate amount of time delivering people from paralysis, insanity, leprosy, and muteness. Which is not to say that there are no nature-caused deaths, deaths that are untimely and slow and pain-ridden, which for that reason raise unanswerable questions. The one thing that should never be said when someone dies is, 'It is the will of God.' That statement is the subtext of today's cliché, by the way. Never do we know enough to say that. My own consolation lies in knowing that it was not the will of God that Alex die, that when the waves closed over the sinking car, God's heart was the first of all our hearts to break. Friends, like Bill Coffin, I do not believe that God gives God's children cancer. I do not believe that God causes people to commit murder. I do not believe that God's will is for someone to die in a car crash. God does not micromanage and control all things. Yet, as revealed in the cross, I do believe in God's power to redeem all things. I believe that God can bring good news, to bring good from tragedy. I believe that God does use tragedy to bring about good and beautiful things from painful experiences. Maybe you've experienced that in your own life. That's certainly the case in my life. But that doesn't mean that God causes the bad things to happen. When I sat with Kim on Monday, we shared conversation, recognizing that there is no explanation or quick answer for Big's untimely death. And she's given me permission to share part of our conversation with you. I know there's not an answer for this, she said, but I'm going to hold on to what I've always told Lainey and Shay, that God has got your back. God's got your back. That's what we know of God, that even in our greatest sufferings, God has got our backs. And not only does God have our backs, but in Jesus, We know that God cares about us so much that he beat us to the grave, transforming death for you and for me. Because our God is a God of life. Thanks be to God for a God like that. Amen.